Hi, I'm Amber Carter, and this is my presentation on Michelangelo for my humanities class. Who is Michelangelo? Michelangelo was born Michele di Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni. He was born March 6, 1475 in Caprice. His father was mayor of Caprice, and when his term ended shortly after Michelangelo was born, they moved back to their native Florence, Italy. Michelangelo's early childhood. After he and his family moved back to Florence, he was sent to a wet nurse on a small farm in Settignano. A wet nurse is a woman that nurses other people's babies. Michelangelo's wet nurse and environment had a huge influence on him. His wet nurse's father and husband were both stonemasons, and Michelangelo often jested later in life that with my wet nurse's milk, I sucked in the hammer and chisels I used for my statues. The life of the artist Michelangelo. Michelangelo was always drawn to art. He loved art so much that at a young age, he asked his father at the age of 13 if he could drop out of grammar school to apprentice a famous painter, Domenico Ghirlandaio, the most famous fresco painter in Florence. Ghirlandaio signed the contract on September 1st, 1485 for these large frescoes on the walls of the choir of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Ghirlandaio and his assistants, among whom was probably the young Michelangelo, completed the frescoes by about 1490. The painting on the right is the Calling of the First Apostles. It's a fresco by Domenico Ghirlandaio, circa 1481 to 1483 in the Sistine Chapel, Vatican Museum, Vatican City. Michelangelo excelled as an apprentice. He excelled so well that other assistants became jealous. One assistant became so jealous that he punched Michelangelo in the face, breaking his nose. Michelangelo was greatly upset by his disfigurement. However, Michelangelo was determined to be a great artist and would not let a bully stop him. To the left is the portrait of the man that broke Michelangelo's nose, Pietro Torrigiano. Attracting royalty. During his apprenticeship, Michelangelo was not only attracting jealous people, but also royalty. Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, was impressed by the young Michelangelo's statues. He was so impressed that he invited Michelangelo to live in the Medici household. Michelangelo lived here for 2 years, where he was able to complete the Battle of Centaurs. Lorenzo died shortly after this piece was completed. The sculpture on the right is sculpted out of marble, and it's called a marble relief. Life after Lorenzo's death. Michelangelo's life drastically changed after the death of Lorenzo. Lorenzo's family was not interested in the arts, so Michelangelo turned his time to studying anatomy. Michelangelo began dissecting corpses in the church of Santo Spirito. He was able to do this because he made a trade. He would carve a crucifix in exchange for the permission to dissect. With the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France and the unstable ruling of the remaining Medici family, Michelangelo packed his things and moved to Venice in 1494. A summons to Rome. In 1496, Michelangelo was summoned to Rome after word of who painted Sleeping Cupid affair got around. This painting is what created Michelangelo's reputation. While in Rome, he carved Bacchus, pictured left out of black marble, for a banker named Jacopo Galli. He also sculpted Pieta, which is currently in St. Peter's for the Cardinal. Entering fame. After carving Pieta, he was launched into fame. He was named Italy's foremost sculptor. In 1501, he returned to Florence, where he carved the infamous David statue. Traditionally, David was portrayed after his victory triumph over Goliath. Both Verrocchio's and Donatello's Davids are depicted standing over Goliath's severed head. Michelangelo has depicted David before the battle. David is tense, but not so much in a physical as in a mental sense. The slingshot he carries over his shoulder is almost invisible, emphasizing that David's victory was one of cleverness, not sheer force. This interpretation comes from Gardner's art throughout the ages. Irving Stone is somewhat more specific in stating that David is depicted at the moment that he decides to engage Goliath. A plan for St. Peter's. After Pope Alexander VI died, Pope Julius II summoned him to work for him. He wanted Michelangelo to create a tomb for him, but grew impatient with the pace he was going and lost interest. Julius then turned to rebuilding the famous St. Peter's Church. Julius gave the project to his favorite architect named Bramante, the Sistine Chapel. He was initially reluctant to accept the commission as he considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, but he was eventually persuaded when he was given leeway to deviate from the original assignment to paint the 12 apostles, allowing him the artistic freedom to create something far more elaborate and time-consuming. By 1512, after 4 years of exhausting labor, however, the ceiling was finally completed. When his work was unveiled, the effect was awe-inspiring, and people would travel hundreds of miles to see this work of an angel. As usual, Michelangelo sent the money he received for the work to his demanding family. Julius died in 1513, leaving money for the completion of his tomb, and Michelangelo moved some marble he had quarried from his workshop near St. Peter's to a house in the Maselle de Corbie, which he kept from 1513 until his death. Successive popes were keen that Michelangelo should work for their own glory and distracted him with other commissions. Then in 1527, Rome was sacked by the imperial troops of Charles V, a mainly Protestant army bent on the destruction of the papacy. An orgy of murder and pillage followed, and Pope Clement VII was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo. The Medici were yet again expelled from Florence, and the Republicans put the artist in charge of the fortifications of his native city. In September 1529, fearing treachery, Michelangelo fled wisely to Venice. Beyond the reach of time. Michelangelo Buonarroti died, giving himself up to God on February 18, 1564, after a slow fever. As Vasari tells us, he made his will in 3 sentences, in front of his physician and his friends, Tommaso Cavalieri and Daniela de Volterra, saying that he left his soul to God, his body to the earth, and his material possessions to his nearest relatives. In reality, there was little left in his house, since some time earlier he had burned much of his artistic material, including, to the great displeasure of Cosimo I, the designs for the facade of San Lorenzo. The body of the dead artist was deposited in a sarcophagus in the church of Santi Apostoli, but a few days after the burial, his nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti, who had arrived in Rome, took possession of his uncle's property and carried off the corpse, concealed in a bale. As soon as they reached Florence, the mortal remains of the divine artist were taken to Santa Croce, where Michelangelo himself had wanted to be buried. The inhabitants of Florence turned out in large numbers, venerating the body of their illustrious fellow citizen, father and master of all the arts, as if it were a sacred relic.